I'd like to begin by asking a question. What causes insurgency? Why do people take up arms against their government? Now, I'm sure you can point to a lot of different contributing factors, whether it's extremist political ideology, religion, which is a very popular one these days for obvious reasons. You can point to lack of water. You can point to poverty. You can point to development gone awry. There's a million things you can point to. But let me tell you, I actually tried very hard to figure this out because I spent 6 years of my life studying the last 5,000 years of guerrilla warfare for a book that I wrote that came out in 2013. And I was trying to figure out what is the commonality? Why do all these rebellions take place? And they've been motivated by so many different movements, and whether it's secessionist, communist, Islamist, a million others throughout history. And what is the one commonality that unites all of these insurgencies? I would argue to you it comes down to two words, two little words: bad governance. That is truly what motivates insurgency. And if you think about, for example, why do we worry about the arc of instability that stretches from West Africa to Central Asia, all these Muslim countries? Obviously, the fact that they're Muslim countries has something to do with it. Obviously, the fact that there is this very potent and powerful extremist ideology of Islamism out there that has a real appeal for people in that region. But there are also other Muslim countries in the world where that ideology has very little appeal, in places like Malaysia, for example. So what separates places like Syria and Iraq from places like Malaysia? Again, I think it comes down to that one simple word, which is governance. I mean, why are people up in arms throughout the Middle East? Because those countries are, let me tone down my language, messed up, okay? You know what I really want to say. They are not well governed. Why? That's why there's an outbreak of rebellion in places like Syria and Iraq. That's why there are revolutions going on throughout the region, because people are not happy with the kind of governance they're getting. If they had the kind of governance that we have here, with all of our faults and much as we hate the government, if they had that, I don't think they would be up in rebellion. This is why, by the way, you can have terrorist groups in Western democratic countries, but they don't get very far. Yeah, it's possible to have the Baader-Meinhof gang running around West Germany. It's possible to have the Weather Underground running around the United States. But do they have insurgencies? No, it's inconceivable to have an insurgency in a well-governed, modern, democratic, liberal, capitalist state. Life is too good for most people to have a substantial number of them, beyond a small number of ideological fanatics, take up arms. That's not the case in the Middle East. So I think that is something very important that we need to keep sight of. It's all about governance. To pick up on what my fellow panelists are saying, what the hell are we doing in the U.S. government to bring better governance to any of these places? The answer is not very much, because we're not set up to do it. We're excellent at dropping bombs, and we can do very precise targeting. I mean, we can put ordnance through a window now if we want to. We're great at that. We can eliminate leaders, a lot of them. Sometimes it takes years, but eventually we will get our man. But is that going to produce better governance? I don't think so. I mean, we did a great job of eliminating Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Did that eliminate AQI? We did a great job of eliminating Osama bin Laden. Did that eliminate al-Qaeda? The Israelis have done a great job in the past of eliminating leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. Did that eliminate those organizations? The answer is pretty obvious. And yet we tend to go to our comfort zone, which is killing people. But much as I'm in favor of all that, it's not sufficient. It's actually not going to achieve the outcome that we seek. And this is something that the U.S. government has long struggled with. It's been a constant, long-standing issue, and it's really been in many ways the source of our biggest failures in places like Vietnam and Somalia and many other battlefields where too many good men have paid the price for our inability to think about long-term governance. At the moment, I am actually writing about somebody who struggled with these issues throughout the course of his extraordinary career. Edward Lansdale, sometimes known as the Quiet American, an Air Force officer who rose to 2-star rank, but really achieved his fame working for the CIA as a troubleshooter, principally in the Philippines and South Vietnam, where he was And he had his most extraordinary success in the Philippines in the early 1950s in helping the Philippines to put down the Huk Rebellion, the communist insurgency, which then led our leadership in Washington, principally Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, to say, do what you did, Ed, in the Philippines, do that in South Vietnam. And he helped to create the state of South Vietnam at a time when very few people thought that this new leader known as Diem had any chance of staying in power more than a month. So he had tremendous success, but he was struggling all the time against the bureaucracy because what he was trying to do was very different from what the bureaucracy was trying to do. He realized, and he really anticipated a lot of the ideas of what we would call population-centric counterinsurgency, but he understood that the key to really defeating an entrenched insurgency like the Huk Rebellion was to win over the people and to get better government in the Philippines, which he did by cultivating a fellow known as Ramon Magsaysay, who became, with his support, defense minister and then was elected president of the Philippines. And together, Magsaysay and Lansdale were this inseparable tag team who worked to end the abusive practices of the Philippine army, which were driving peasants into the arms of the Huks, to get them to stop bombarding barrios and to stop stealing from the people, to start treating the people the right way, to wean them away from this communist insurgency. Basic coin 101, stuff everybody in this room knows and most of you have probably practiced on the ground. But it was a hard sell to the U.S. Military. It was a hard sell to the Philippine military, to any conventional military force in 1950, just as in many ways it still is today. And so Lansdale really struggled with this, and ultimately he was defeated by it, because by the time he got to Vietnam on his second tour in 1965, the idea of trying to win over the people had largely been lost. Aside from some isolated efforts, it had been subsumed in this larger firepower-intensive approach to warfare, which, as we know, was deeply problematic, did not achieve the outcomes that we sought. And we don't use that kind of indiscriminate type of firepower anymore. We use very discriminate and precise firepower, but we still struggle with trying to achieve the with focusing on the political end state, as Lansdale tried to do. And he would often quote Lansdale to people in the CIA, State Department, and military who didn't see what he was doing, who said, "Why are you backing this political candidate in the election for president in the Philippines in 1953? Why do you think it's so important to get Ramon Magsaysay elected president?" And he would quote to them from Mao Zedong, who said, "There are often military elements who care only for military affairs but not politics. Such one-track minded officers, ignoring the interconnection between politics and military affairs, must be made to understand the correct relationship between the two. All military actions are meant to achieve political objectives, while military action itself is a manifested form of politics." Now, that's not rocket science. That's basically Mao restating Clausewitz. Everybody knows that, but we don't act on it, and that is very, very frustrating. What will we do if we would actually try to act on those insights? I think we would make some changes in the way that the U.S. government is organized. And I would just throw out a handful of ideas here, none of which are probably, or very few of which are going to be realized anytime soon, but I think we need to think about how we do this. We don't have, one of the primary problems we face is we don't have a single agency of the U.S. government which is actually devoted to governance, to nation building, because the idea of nation building is anathema to us. We don't want to be in the nation building business. We're often told by our highest political leadership that nation building begins at home. Well, I think everybody on this panel understands that we need to have nation building abroad. Otherwise, we're going to be sending a lot of folks wearing uniforms very similar to yours downrange into some pretty hairy situations, because if we don't have nation states downrange that are capable of keeping peace and order, law and order on their own, what does that do? That creates gaps which extremist groups like ISIS can exploit, and then we wind up getting sucked in to deal with the resulting problems. So I would argue that we need a nation-building agency, and I think the logical place to put it is in USAID, which to my mind has this kind of amorphous, feel-good, do development stuff around the world type of mission. Well, as we just heard, there are a lot of private charities that do very similar work. I would suggest let's leave that feel-good, improve the condition of mankind type of mission to the private charities that are involved in that. I'm all in favor of that. As far as I'm concerned, USAID needs to be doing state building in support of vital national objectives, but that is not their mindset. It would require radical reorientation of the agency, and it would require a lot more funding, and I think, frankly, And sorry, Sarah, but I think it would also require breaking it away from the State Department, making it an independent agency that really focuses and tries to mobilize nation-building expertise from across the U.S. government. I think one of the best ways of doing that, by the way, is by taking a lot of veterans of the U.S. military, especially the Army and Marine Corps, who, as we speak, are currently being fired because of these disgraceful spending cuts that we're enduring to our defense budget. We're laying off a lot of good men and women who have had tremendous experience downrange, in fact, doing nation building in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. AID ought to be hiring a lot of them, I think, to really improve its capacity to do nation building. That's really the kind of expertise and capacity that it needs. The military, by the way, can also, I think, despite its tremendous practical experience, can also improve its attention to governance. And I think USASOC is trying to do some of that by setting up this new Institute for Governance, but we need a school of governance. This needs to be an Army-wide and a military-wide effort. We need to train military folks in doing governance, because at the end of the day, this is how we're going to win these wars. Not necessarily with the U.S. occupation, but we need to be at least, even if we're not going to be occupying countries, we need to be helping local governments to do governance, and we need to do that ourselves. And no matter how much capacity we can create at AID or other places, and I'm skeptical that this is going to happen anytime soon, the reality is the military is still going to have more resources than anybody else, so you'd better figure out how to do this and institutionalize some of that knowledge you've gained on the ground in the course of the last decade. I think a related capacity that we desperately need to develop is political warfare, which is something we don't even talk about anymore. But I mean, when you think about it, okay, we can counter terrorist groups like ISIS, sort of, we can drop bombs on them, but what are we doing to counter the insidious campaign for influence that the Quds Force is waging across the Middle East? The Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, we just heard, I think that was a great example about how Hezbollah has taken control of Lebanon as a political entity. What are we doing to counter that? Are we going to drop bombs on Hezbollah? We're not. We need to figure out some way to counter the insidious political hold that terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and ISIS and many others are gaining over population centers. We need to figure out how to empower more moderate elements, how to wage political warfare. That's something we don't even talk about anymore. It was talked about a lot in the early days of the Cold War when people like Lansdale were out there on the front lines in places like the Philippines trying to figure out how to elect simpatico leaders. We don't even talk about that anymore. We need to develop that capacity. And I actually came up with my friend Mike Duran of the Brookings Institution. We did a little policy paper at the Council on Foreign Relations on how we can do that using the counterterrorist model, creating a coordinator for political warfare in the White House, creating career tracks in the CIA and State Department and military, people who would actually wage political warfare for a living. I don't have time here to spell it out in detail, but this would be kind of a revolutionary concept. But it's something we need to focus on, because that political warfare in the end is going to be much more decisive than kinetic warfare. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think those are my key recommendations. But the bottom line is, we got to focus on governance. We can't just talk about it. We actually got to do something about it, because we're never going to win the long war against Islamist extremism. We're never going to win a lot of other wars unless we have governance at the end of it. And by the way, that's true no matter how much ordnance we drop. I mean, look at even the case of Japan, where we obliterated that country in the end with 2 nuclear weapons. Why did the World War II turn out so well as it did for us in the case of Japan? It was only partially because we obliterated Japan. It also had to do a lot with the MacArthur Regency, with the way that Douglas MacArthur paid a lot of attention to governance, to trying to convert Japan from being an enemy into an ally of the United States. And I would submit to you, if we hadn't done that, Japan could have been very problematic instead of a pillar of security in Northeast Asia for the last half century. We need to think about that. We need to get back to that mindset of thinking about governance and political warfare, because if we don't, we will continue to pay a very high price for our inattention and ignorance.